When Evan Rourke pulled onto his property, the east wall of the garage his grandfather had built in 1968 lay in broken brick beneath a construction excavator. Victoria Blackwell, CEO of Blackwell Dominion Automotive, needed one shortcut to route her convoy to a $200 million launch, and she had been told the single father running a restoration shop on Red Haven's edge would take a check and walk away. Evan didn't raise his voice. He found a steel door behind the demolished wall and opened a safe no one from Blackwell knew existed. 3 days later, not one of their vehicles moved. Stay until the end to find out what was hidden in that wall and why it stopped everything. Evan had left Red Haven before sunrise that morning with a fully restored 1964 Chevrolet Corvette strapped to a flatbed, delivering it to a collector 3 counties away who had waited 11 months for the work to be finished. The drive back felt familiar in the way that all returning roads feel familiar. The same highway curve, the same exit ramp, the same right turn past the grain elevator that marked the last 2 miles home. He noticed the construction equipment from the top of the hill. A yellow excavator, 2 flatbed trucks loaded with concrete barriers, and a crew of workers in high-visibility vests moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had already been paid and had no intention of stopping. The chain-link fence that had separated his lot from the neighboring industrial parcel had been unbolted and pushed to the side, and the east wall of Rourke Heritage Garage, the one his grandfather had poured block by block the summer before Evan's father was born, had been reduced to a debris field that stretched across the rear of the property. Evan parked the truck, stepped out without hurrying, and walked toward the site foreman, who looked up from a clipboard with the expression of a man who had navigated these conversations before and expected to navigate this one the same way. The foreman handed over a document before Evan had finished his first sentence. A 2-page emergency demolition authorization stamped with the city's commercial development seal and a Blackwell Dominion project identifier. He explained that the corridor fell within the approved industrial easement boundary, that the structure had been flagged as a non-load-bearing outbuilding with no recorded historical designation, and that the site team had begun work at 6 that morning, pursuant to the authorization. Evan read the document twice, set it on the hood of the foreman's truck, and said that the garage was registered private property under a deed held continuously by his family since 1968, and that no one from Blackwell Dominion had ever knocked on his door. The foreman shrugged in the way that people shrug when they work for someone with more lawyers than their opponent, reached for his radio, and placed a call that brought a black SUV through the new gap in the fence within 4 minutes. Victoria Blackwell stepped out wearing a hard hat over a tailored jacket, accompanied by 2 aides and a man Evan would later come to understand was Sterling Carradine, the chief operating officer of the company and the person most responsible for the schedule she had agreed to keep. She moved across the broken brick without slowing down, assessed Evan once with the economical attention of someone who rarely wasted time on introductions, and said that her team's survey data and the city's digitized parcel map both placed this corridor within the boundary of the industrial zone Blackwell had acquired the previous year. She offered him a handshake and a number, an accelerated acquisition payment she described as generous given the assessed value, and said her legal team had mailed formal notice to the address of record 6 weeks prior. Evan told her he had received no such notice. Victoria said the postal record would reflect otherwise. Sterling stood slightly behind her, watching Evan with the patient attention of a man running probability calculations on whether this would resolve cheaply or expensively. Evan refused the offer. He told her the wall had not belonged to the corridor. It had belonged to the building on the lot behind it, a lot he held free and clear. Victoria said the original survey line placed the eastern boundary of his parcel 17 feet north of where he believed it to be, that the corridor had been a historical right-of-way attached to the industrial zone, and that his grandfather had built the wall across a line that was never his to use. Evan said that was not how his grandfather had described the deed, and that he intended to find out exactly what that deed said before he signed anything. Victoria offered her card, told him her team would be in touch, and turned back toward the SUV with the body language of someone who had already moved on to the next item on her agenda. It was Evan, moving through the rubble to retrieve the garage's tool inventory, who noticed the edge of a steel door embedded in the remaining section of the east wall, a door he had never seen, because it had always been behind the workbench his grandfather had built flush against the brick. The safe was small, the kind bolted into masonry in the 1970s, with a dial combination left at its last setting. Inside, beneath a layer of protective cloth that had browned but not disintegrated, was a bound set of documents, a rolled tube of drafting paper, and a letter on top written in the careful cursive of a man who had learned to write with a fountain pen. Evan didn't read the letter in full standing there in the rubble. He read the first line, which said, "If they have come back to this road, it means they still have not settled the old account." He carried the safe to his truck, drove it to the back of the lot, and sat with it in the cab for a long time before he called anyone. 6 weeks before Evan came home to find his wall demolished, Victoria Blackwell had been standing in a glass-walled conference room 40 floors above Detroit, staring at a timeline that no longer added up. The Blackwell Tempest was positioned to be the company's flagship electric vehicle, a limited production performance car priced above $1 million per unit, announced 2 years prior with enough momentum from industry press and investor enthusiasm to carry the stock through 3 consecutive quarters of otherwise unremarkable earnings. The launch event had been designed as a spectacle, a convoy of Tempests rolling from the assembly facility across the Red Haven circuit through the new customer experience complex on the edge of Lake Millard and onto a purpose-built demonstration stage where pre-order holders, automotive press, and a curated list of institutional investors would watch the cars perform at speed. The date had been locked for 8 months and could not be moved without triggering a performance clause in the investment agreement that would allow 2 anchor funds to demand repayment of their preferred shares. The routing problem had surfaced in the spring when the primary access road between the assembly facility and the lakeside stage failed 2 consecutive soil stability assessments, requiring a full redesign that pushed the projected completion date 4 weeks past the launch. Sterling Carradine had identified the alternative, a service corridor running behind a strip of older industrial buildings near the southern edge of the acquired zone, connecting the secondary factory exit directly to the demonstration road without requiring the contested bridge crossing. The path was rougher and would need surfacing, but Sterling told Victoria it saved $18 million in bridge construction, eliminated the permitting delay entirely, and put the convoy back on schedule. He said the corridor was part of the industrial easement the company had purchased, and that the legal team had reviewed it. Victoria asked him to confirm the property status was clean. Sterling told her it was being finalized and that she could sign the construction authorization as a preliminary approval pending the administrative close. What Sterling knew and Victoria did not was that the legal team had flagged the Rourke parcel 3 weeks earlier, noting that a separate deed appeared to govern the eastern structure and the rear lot access, and that the city's digital parcel map had absorbed an error during its conversion from the 1994 hand-drawn survey, shifting the recorded eastern boundary of the Rourke property approximately 17 feet north of its actual position. The attorney who wrote the flag, had recommended direct contact with the property owner before any physical work began. Sterling had marked the memo for review and scheduled no follow-up. The authorization Victoria signed listed the action category as temporary industrial corridor preparation and did not specify which structures would require modification. The contractor had been briefed separately, in a meeting Sterling attended without Victoria. Evan Rourke had been aware that something was happening near the back of his lot for the better part of 2 weeks before the demolition, though he had attributed it to the general construction activity that had been expanding through the old Red Haven industrial zone all spring. His daughter Sadie, who was 13 and spent most weekends photographing the neighborhood with a film camera her mother had left behind, had come inside one afternoon and told him there were people with measuring equipment near the fence again. Evan had walked out, seen a pair of men in Blackwell vests with a laser rangefinder, and told them politely that the property line was marked and the gate was private. They had thanked him and moved on without explanation. Sadie had kept photographing anyway, the way people her age photograph things that feel like they might matter later, without knowing quite why. The garage had been operating at a loss for the better part of 18 months. 3 of Evan's longtime restoration clients had moved or passed away. The regional collector market had softened, and the cost of maintaining equipment that was itself a decade past its optimal service life had climbed past what 2 or 3 jobs per quarter could cover. A real estate investment firm had sent offers 4 times in 2 years, each one higher than the last, and each time Evan had filed it in the folder he kept under the front desk without composing a reply. When Sadie had asked him one quiet Sunday afternoon why they didn't just sell and move somewhere easier, Evan had told her that the garage wasn't a building. It was proof that their family had built something worth keeping. He had not expected that sentence to be tested so soon. In the last photograph Sadie had taken of the surveyors, she had caught Sterling Carradine standing beside a folded map, his finger tracing a line across a page that had the words Rock Parcel written clearly in the header. In the background, a man in a jacket bearing a legal firm logo was pointing at the private property notice bolted to the gate. Eleanor Whitlock had known Evan's wife before the illness, had met Evan himself at holiday gatherings years ago, and had agreed to see him the afternoon after the demolition without asking what it was about, because the voice on the phone had told her enough. She ran a 4-person practice in downtown Red Haven that handled land disputes, historic right-of-way claims, and a particular subspecialty in correcting the kind of boundary errors that digital mapping systems introduced when county offices converted handwritten survey records to GIS without independent verification. She spread Evan's documents across her conference table, pulled a current parcel overlay from the county database on her monitor, and spent 40 minutes cross-referencing before she said a word about what she was looking at. The deed in Walter Rourke's safe was a 1968 conveyance from the Red Haven Municipal Land Authority granting permanent ownership of the garage parcel and, critically, a 17-foot rear access corridor that connected it to what had then been called the Red Haven Motor Works Test Loop, a private circuit used for performance validation by the small automaker that had operated in the industrial zone from 1952 until its closure in 1979. The corridor rights had been written into the deed in perpetuity as a condition of the conveyance. Tied to the maintenance obligation, Walter had accepted for a service access gate at the edge of the old circuit. The digital parcel map currently used by the city did not reflect the corridor. It had vanished during the conversion, absorbed into the boundary of the industrial zone when survey points were re-entered without cross-referencing the original deed language. Eleanor told Evan that Blackwell's lawyers had worked from the digital map and had never pulled the underlying deed, and that the photographs his daughter had captured. specifically the one showing a Blackwell attorney pointing at a private property notice, were going to be relevant. The case for an emergency injunction was strong, Eleanor said, but the documents in the safe had opened a second question that was considerably more complicated than a boundary dispute. Among the rolled drawings in the tube was a set of engineering specifications dated 1971, hand-titled Rark Feok Freem, covering a chassis geometry system for high-performance rear-wheel drive vehicles that used a passive torque redistribution crossmember to reduce rear axle instability under high-speed lateral loading. The design was detailed, annotated in Walter's hand, and accompanied by a correspondence file that included a letter from Red Haven Motor Works Management attempting to claim the design as a work-for-hire invention, Walter's written refusal citing a specific clause in his employment contract that reserved patent rights for designs developed on personal time using personal materials, and a final letter from Walter noting that the dispute had never been resolved and that he was retaining the originals. Eleanor set that stack aside and told Evan she was not an intellectual property attorney, but that she knew enough to recognize the question of who owned the Rourke vector frame had never been legally settled. Evan had brought a photograph with him, a still pulled from a trade publication showing the undercarriage of a Blackwell Tempest prototype during a test session, taken by an automotive journalist, allowed limited access at a media day 2 months prior. He set it on the table next to Walter's drawings. The crossmember configuration, the suspension geometry, and the torque redistribution mounting points were not identical to Walter's design, but the structural logic was the same in ways that Evan, who had spent 20 years rebuilding precisely this kind of chassis architecture, recognized without hesitation. Eleanor looked at both documents for a long time, then told him she was going to need to refer him to an intellectual property colleague before they filed anything related to the technology, but that the land case was clean and she was ready to move immediately. Victoria Blackwell received Evan's formal demand letter on a Wednesday morning and scheduled a meeting for the following Thursday, which told Evan she still believed this was a real estate negotiation that could be closed before the weekend. She met him in a ground-floor conference room at the Blackwell Regional Office with 2 attorneys, and no Sterling Carradine, who had apparently decided the meeting was beneath his personal involvement. She was prepared to offer $1.5 million for a full easement release, property restoration costs, and a waiver of further claims. Evan set a copy of Walter's deed on the table, told her the corridor was not for sale and never had been, and said that until Blackwell restored the wall and rerouted its project corridor, no vehicle associated with the Tempest launch was going to cross Rourke property. Victoria said halting the project would affect the livelihoods of more than 400 workers who depended on the launch timeline. Evan told her the workers hadn't demolished his wall. She looked at the deed, then at the photograph of the Tempest undercarriage Evan had placed beside it, and the composure she had carried through every negotiation in her career developed a visible crack for the first time. Victoria's legal team spent 48 hours drafting a position paper, arguing that the Rourke vector frame had been developed within the scope of Walter's employment at Red Haven Motor Works, that the company's asset sale in 1982 had transferred all engineering documentation to a succession of automotive companies that had ultimately merged into the Blackwell corporate family, and that any intellectual property dispute had long since exceeded the statute of limitations. The position was logically constructed and probably sufficient to delay a legal challenge for months. What the position paper did not address was the component in Evan's safe, a physical prototype crossmember, machined aluminum with a hand-stamped series marker beginning with the letters RVF, which had been sitting alongside Walter's drawings since the day he sealed the safe. Evan brought it to a machinist he trusted in Lansing, who measured it against the specifications in Walter's drawings and confirmed it matched to manufacturing tolerance. Through Eleanor's intellectual property colleague, Evan then obtained a deposition transcript from a retired Blackwell supplier, interviewed in an unrelated parts provenance case, in which the supplier referenced a chassis stabilization component sourced from a pre-acquisition archive that he described as dating from the original Red Haven Motor Works Technical Library, with an internal Blackwell classification number that began with RVF. Graham Winslow had been Blackwell Dominion's chief vehicle engineer for 9 years, had a reputation across the domestic performance car industry for refusing to approve production readiness until his own satisfaction was complete, regardless of schedule pressure, and had been kept partially in the dark about the Rourke situation by Sterling on the grounds that it was a real estate matter and not an engineering concern. Graham had nonetheless been troubled for several weeks by a discrepancy in the Tempest's chassis documentation. Specifically, the attribution of the crossmember geometry to an internal development file from 2022 that, when he pulled the original design session records, referenced an archived drawing set rather than original computer-aided design work. He had filed an inquiry with the archive management team and received a response that satisfied him superficially but left a residue of unease he hadn't fully resolved when Evan's demand letter and its accompanying technical exhibit arrived at the company's legal desk. Graham requested a meeting with Evan through Eleanor's office. They met at the garage, where Evan spread Walter's drawings on the main workbench beside the physical prototype. Graham studied the documents for nearly an hour without speaking, making occasional notes, and when he looked up he said that the fundamental mechanical principle in the vector frame design, the specific geometry of the passive redistribution crossmember, and the angular relationship between the mounting points and the rear subframe, was the same in both systems. He said the modern implementation used materials and tolerances that Walter's 1971 prototype couldn't have accessed, but that the underlying engineering insight was identical, and that it was not the kind of coincidence that happened twice independently. He told Evan he had not known the design had a history outside the company's own archive, that he believed the attribution in the development file was wrong, and that he needed time to understand how the documentation had been structured before any of it became public. Walter's journals described the vector frame in the language of a man who was simultaneously excited about what he had built and angry that the company he worked for kept insisting it belonged to them. He had declined 3 escalating offers from Red Haven Motor Works management to purchase the design outright, had refused to sign an amended employment agreement that would have retroactively classified the work as company property, and had noted in the final entry before the company closed that he was placing the originals in a location where they would survive whatever happened to the building and whoever bought it. He had also written, in an entry dated months before his death, that the system he designed had a defect he had never fully resolved, a condition he described in terms that were technically precise but unmistakable in their practical implication. Under specific high-speed cornering loads, the crossmember geometry created a transient redistribution event that the electronic stability technology of his era could not compensate for quickly enough, and the consequence was a rear axle response that could overcome a driver's input at the worst possible moment. Victoria had not been told about the safety notation. Sterling had reviewed a summary of the safe's contents prepared by outside counsel and had flagged the intellectual property items for the position paper, but the single paragraph in Walter's final journal entry describing the unresolved defect had been characterized in the summary as a general maintenance note rather than a safety concern. Victoria first heard the word defect from Graham Winslow, who came to her office on a Friday afternoon, placed the journal excerpt in front of her, and asked her, in the measured voice of someone who has already decided what he is going to say, whether anyone had run a stability simulation of the Tempest against the specific load conditions Walter had described. Victoria came to the garage alone that evening, driving herself in a car that wasn't from the Blackwell lineup. She had taken 2 hours to read everything Graham had given her and another hour to make phone calls she wouldn't describe in detail, and when she sat down across from Evan at the workbench he used as a desk, she looked like someone who had spent the day revising a set of assumptions she had built her plans around. She told him she understood the land dispute was real, that the deed was valid, and that her company had moved without sufficient verification. She said she wanted to resolve it before it went further. Then she placed a written proposal on the bench and waited. The offer was significant. Full reconstruction of the demolished wall at Blackwell's expense, a payment of $5 million for a long-term easement on the corridor, a named acknowledgement of Walter Rourke in the company's Heritage Archive and in the physical lobby of the new facility, a consulting contract for Evan as an independent technical advisor, and a written stipulation that the demolition was the result of contractor error rather than authorized company action. In return, Evan would sign a release covering the land claim, the intellectual property question, and any public statement about the events to date. Victoria told him she was making the offer personally rather than through legal channels, because she wanted him to know it came directly from her. Evan read each page carefully, set them down in order, and said he had one question before he responded. If the technology in the Tempest was not rightfully the company's, why was the solution to pay him money rather than to say so publicly? Victoria said the two things were legally separate and practically complex, that the intellectual property claim would take years to resolve, and that the company had obligations to employees and investors that could not wait for a litigation timeline. Evan told her he understood all of that, and that he was going to refuse. He said the offer was asking him to protect a project built in part on the erasure of his grandfather's work, in exchange for the kind of money that made the erasure feel comfortable for everyone involved. He said his grandfather had refused similar offers from people with more leverage, and he had spent a long time figuring out why that had mattered. Victoria did not argue immediately. She said he needed to understand the stakes. 500 people depended on this launch. The company's credit facility had covenants tied to the event date, and if the project stalled, the consequences would reach people who had nothing to do with what happened to his garage. Evan said those people hadn't demolished his wall, and that if the project was too fragile to survive a brief delay caused by its own legal misconduct, the real problem wasn't his refusal. He asked her, before she left, whether she had run the simulation Graham had described. She told him it was scheduled. He told her that when the results came back, she should call him. Sterling Carradine's response arrived 3 days later through the city's commercial compliance department. A formal notice that Rourke Heritage Garage had been identified as potentially non-compliant with updated industrial zone standards, that a vehicle disposal and soil contamination assessment had been flagged for the property, and that the city would be initiating a review of the operating license. The notice was dated the same week as Evan's refusal, and 2 of the specific violations cited matched language from a Blackwell internal memo that Eleanor obtained through a public records request filed the same afternoon she saw the notice. Eleanor told Evan it was pressure, not law, and that the complaint would go nowhere once they responded with documentation. She also told him to file the injunction application that evening rather than waiting until Monday, because Sterling was not going to slow down on his own. The temporary restraining order was granted at 9:45 on a Tuesday morning by a circuit court judge, who read Eleanor's brief alongside the surveyor's correction report, the deed photographs, and the parcel overlay showing the digitization error, and concluded in a 14-page ruling that there was sufficient cause to believe Blackwell Dominion had conducted physical work on private property without lawful authorization, and that the ongoing use of the corridor for project access constituted continuing trespass. The order prohibited any Blackwell vehicles from crossing the Rourke parcel boundary, suspended construction on the contested section of the project corridor, placed a preservation hold on all engineering documentation relating to the Tempest chassis system, and froze any modification or disposal of materials bearing the RVF designation pending further proceedings. It landed on a week when the Tempest launch was 31 days away. The first consequence was logistical. The convoy route was severed, and there was no approved alternative that could be prepared in under a month. The second was financial. 2 of the 5 institutional investors with performance clause agreements demanded an emergency board briefing, which was scheduled within 48 hours, and which Victoria attended knowing that Sterling would be in the room with a prepared narrative that did not reflect what she now understood about the situation. The third was public. A trade journalist who covered the automotive sector had been following the Blackwell land dispute through county filing notices since Eleanor first appeared in the public record, and on the morning after the restraining order was issued, the journalist published a piece with enough accurate detail to tell the industry community that the Tempest launch had been halted by a dispute involving both a land rights violation and an unresolved question about the provenance of the car's chassis technology. The board meeting was the most difficult professional hour Victoria had experienced in 9 years as chief executive, not because the questions were unfair, but because she had to answer them without being able to say with confidence what she had known and when, and because Sterling sat 3 seats away and answered every question that came his way with the smooth preparedness of a man who had anticipated every line of inquiry. He presented the situation as a regulatory misunderstanding exploited by an opportunistic property owner, characterized the intellectual property question as a dormant claim with no legal merit, and described Victoria's pause of the technical review process as an overcautious response to pressure that was increasing project costs by the day. He stopped short of recommending her removal but used language that made the board understand he was considering it. Graham had spent 3 days running the stability simulation that Walter's journal described, using the exact load parameters Walter had specified, a high-speed lane change combined with a full throttle exit at the apex of a decreasing radius curve. The results were not catastrophic in the way that headline accidents are catastrophic, but they were measurable. In 11 of the 36 scenarios Graham ran, the Tempest's rear axle response during the transient redistribution event exceeded the designed intervention threshold for the electronic stability program by a margin that a professional driver would manage and an enthusiast driver would not. Graham presented the findings to Victoria the morning after the board meeting, not to Sterling, and said that in his professional judgment, the car was not ready for a public demonstration at the velocities the launch plan specified, and that he could not certify the vehicle for the event as currently configured. Sadie came to the garage after school that afternoon and watched her father read Graham's report summarily at the workbench, and then set it down and look at the temporary panels they had installed where the east wall had been. She asked him if they were sure they were doing the right thing, because 2 of her teachers had said he was the person making the launch fall apart, and one of them had mentioned that friends' parents worked at the assembly facility. Evan looked at her for a moment before answering. He said that doing the right thing didn't mean no one got hurt. It meant you didn't keep building something wrong just because stopping it had become expensive. Sadie thought about that for a while, then went back to her camera. Evan called Victoria after Graham presented his findings, told her he wanted to share something from Walter's journal that she needed to see in person, and asked her to come to the garage rather than a conference room. She came. He showed her the specific journal entries, walked her through the load conditions Walter had identified, and placed Graham's simulation results on the table beside Walter's description of the problem as he had understood it in 1971. The correlation was exact in a way that required no engineering expertise to recognize. An old mechanic working with slide rules and physical prototypes had documented the same failure envelope that a modern simulation suite had just reproduced. Victoria read both documents twice, asked Graham, who was present, 3 technical questions, and then said that the launch was going to have to be suspended. Sterling heard about the decision within the hour, arrived at the garage before Victoria had left, and spent 40 minutes arguing that the simulation data was derived from a disputed source, that the load conditions Walter had described were unrealistic for a controlled demonstration, and that suspending the launch on the basis of documents from a legal adversary was the most operationally reckless decision Victoria had made in her tenure. He said a limited demonstration at reduced speed with professional drivers would satisfy the investor obligations without exposing the car to the conditions Graham had tested. Victoria told him she would not present the Tempest as a high-performance vehicle to buyers who had committed more than $1 million per unit, while the company knew there was an unresolved question about its safety at the performance level they were selling. Sterling turned to the 2 board observers attending the meeting and said, with the measured certainty of a man who had been building toward this moment for weeks, that the CEO was allowing a land dispute to determine the operational direction of a $200 million program. Evan had not asked for money in that meeting. He had not asked for a position or a title. When Victoria asked him what he actually wanted, he said he wanted the wall rebuilt, the trespass acknowledged, his grandfather credited, the technology question resolved honestly, and the car fixed before anyone drove it at speed in public. He said if those things happened, he would withdraw his objection to the project entirely, and Blackwell could build its launch on terms that wouldn't come apart the moment someone started asking questions. Victoria looked at him with the particular expression of someone encountering a version of a situation they had faced before, but from the other side of it. Over the following 2 weeks, Victoria came to the garage several times while she and Graham worked through the modification options for the crossmember geometry, and she began to understand, watching Evan work on an unrelated restoration project during their conversations, that his knowledge of the vector frame architecture was not theoretical. He had grown up watching his grandfather work with the prototype crossmember, had spent years replicating similar geometry in vintage chassis work, and understood the failure mode Walter had described not as an abstraction, but as a physical behavior he had observed in real metal at real speed. He suggested a mounting offset adjustment that reduced the transient redistribution moment without altering the fundamental geometry, and Graham tested it in the simulation and confirmed it addressed 9 of the 11 critical scenarios. They worked through the remaining 2 over 3 sessions at the whiteboard Evan had bolted to the garage wall where the east window used to be. Victoria observed all of it, and what she understood by the end was not that she had been wrong about the Tempest's potential. The car was genuinely extraordinary, but that the foundation it had been built on was cracked in ways that Sterling had chosen to ignore, and that she had not looked closely enough to find. Sterling, who had spent the same 2 weeks meeting privately with 3 board members and preparing materials for a governance review, discovered through a contact at the garage's insurance provider that Victoria had quietly authorized the cross-member modification. which was enough to call the board session he had been constructing for weeks. Sterling presented his case to the board. In a session, Victoria was invited to attend but not to lead, framing the sequence of events as a pattern of executive failure. She had signed the construction authorization without verifying the property status. She had allowed a land dispute to escalate into a public relations crisis. She had suspended the launch on the basis of unverified data from a legal adversary, and she had authorized engineering modifications to a production vehicle outside the standard approval process. Each point was accurate in isolation. Taken together, Sterling argued, they described a CEO who had let a single adversarial property owner determine the operational direction of a $200 million program, and he said the board should consider whether a change in leadership was necessary before the launch could be rescued. 3 of the 7 voting board members had been receiving Sterling's private briefings for 2 weeks. The session ran 4 hours and ended without resolution, with the board requesting a 48-hour period for Victoria to respond. Sterling used those 48 hours to prepare a compressed version of the original launch. A private investor demonstration at the alternate test facility using the pre-modification vehicle, attended only by the 5 principal investors, the 10 top pre-order clients, and a small media pool traveling under embargo. He told the board it could proceed without triggering the restraining order since it would not use the Rourke parcel. He did not tell the board that he had already briefed the event logistics team, that 2 professional drivers had been told to prepare, or that he had quietly instructed the test facility team to run the cars at full performance specifications rather than the limited speed Victoria had specified. Evan found out about the planned demonstration through Graham, who had been copied on a logistics memo he was not supposed to have seen and who called Evan that evening. Eleanor moved immediately. She filed a motion with the circuit court noting that the planned demonstration constituted a violation of the preservation hold on the unmodified vehicle, that the event would involve adjacent public roads within the original injunction scope, and that the engineering documentation freeze made it legally impermissible for Blackwell to certify the vehicle for any performance event. She also filed a separate notice with the State Vehicle Safety Authority, attaching Graham's simulation findings and Walter's journal excerpt, requesting a hold on the vehicle's event certification. The insurance provider received formal notification that the planned demonstration was proceeding under disputed safety documentation. The professional drivers withdrew the morning of the event. The 2 principal investors, whose funds were subject to the performance clause, issued a joint statement requesting postponement pending clarification of the safety documentation. The insurance hold meant no coverage attached to the event, and the test facility manager, unwilling to accept personal liability, closed the facility to Blackwell vehicles until the certification question was resolved through standard channels. Sterling stood on the test apron watching the logistics team load the cars back onto transporters. The board, informed of the collapse in real time, convened an emergency session without waiting for his report. Victoria had spent the morning preparing for a different kind of appearance. She drove to the parking area in front of the idle assembly facility, where 2 automotive journalists and a local news camera had gathered after following the court filings, and she spoke without a prepared statement. She said that the land on which a portion of the Tempest program had been developed had not been acquired with the owner's consent and that her company owed Evan Rourke a direct apology. She said that the chassis technology at the core of the Tempest's performance system had design origins that Blackwell had inherited without proper attribution, and that the company intended to correct the record. She said a safety question had been identified in the vehicle's behavior at performance speeds, that the modification required to address it had been developed in collaboration with the engineer whose grandfather had originally designed the system, and that no tempest would be demonstrated at speed until that modification had been independently certified. She said the launch was postponed indefinitely, took no questions, and drove back toward Redhaven. The board session convened on a Thursday with Evan present at Eleanor's request, seated at a side table with Graham, whose presence had been requested by two independent board members who wanted a technical witness. Sterling opened by placing a single email on the table. A message sent from Victoria's account 8 weeks prior acknowledging a summary of the legal team's preliminary assessment that the Rourke parcel status was not fully resolved. He said this demonstrated Victoria had been informed of the risk before authorizing the construction work. Victoria did not deny it. She said she had received the summary, that it had been characterized to her as an administrative detail being handled, and that she had signed the authorization trusting that characterization. She said she had been wrong to trust without verifying, and that the signature was hers and the responsibility was hers. Sterling told the board that Victoria's public statement had caused irreversible damage to the Tempest's commercial position, that she had validated every claim of a legal adversary while the case was still pending, and that the company needed leadership capable of protecting its position rather than confessing to it. He said the path forward was straightforward. Settle the land claim on market rate terms, contest the intellectual property question on the grounds of time limitation, proceed with a revised launch on the alternate route, and restore investor confidence through decisive action. He said the only thing standing between Blackwell Dominion and a successful recovery was the CEO's unwillingness to act like one. Evan spoke when invited, and he spoke briefly. He confirmed that Victoria's had signed the demolition authorization. He confirmed that she had initially offered him money in exchange for his silence about both the land claim and the technology question. He then told the board that when she had learned about the safety data, she had suspended the launch before he had asked her to, and that Sterling Carradine had attempted to run the vehicle at full performance speed after that suspension while the preservation hold was in effect. He told them that Sterling had known about the Rourke parcel boundary question before construction began, had suppressed the attorney's recommendation to contact the property owner, and had structured the authorization request to prevent Victoria from knowing the full scope of what she was approving. He said he was not there to protect Victoria Blackwell's career or to destroy it. He was there to make sure the person who had deliberately chosen to overwrite the truth could not rewrite it again in this room. Graham followed with the documentary record. The email thread in which Sterling had directed the archive team to reclassify the RVF file under a new internal identifier. The message chain in which a legal department recommendation to contact the Rourke family had been marked closed without action. The safety simulation findings that had been delivered to Sterling 6 days before he organized the private demonstration, and a financial disclosure showing that Sterling's compensation structure included a $40 million performance incentive triggered by the launch completing on the original date. The board voted to suspend Sterling Carradine pending an independent investigation, to engage outside counsel for a full review of the RVF documentation chain, and to accept Victoria's proposed settlement framework as the basis for resolving the Rourke claims. Victoria still faced a governance review and mandatory independent oversight. She had not been forgiven, only retained. Evan and Eleanor signed the preliminary agreement the following week. The rebuilt garage went up over 8 weeks in the early spring, framed in the same dimensions as the original, with the same east-facing windows and the same concrete apron that Walter had poured in 1968. Evan had kept a portion of the original brick, the pieces intact enough to use, and the mason worked them into the lower section of the new east wall, so that the oldest material in the structure was at the foundation. The Rourke Heritage Garage sign was remounted the day the exterior was finished, and below it, on a separate panel that the Preservation Fund's Historical Committee had proposed, a second line read, "Birthplace of the Veroth, Freem." Sadie photographed it from across the street the morning it went up and put the print in a frame without saying anything about it to her father, leaving it on the workbench where he would find it. Sterling Carradine was dismissed from Blackwell Dominion following the independent investigation, which found that he had suppressed 3 separate legal assessments related to the Rourke parcel, had directed the reclassification of archival documents bearing the RVF designation, had withheld a safety simulation from the board, and had organized a vehicle demonstration in violation of a court preservation order. His performance incentive was voided. His board memberships at 2 other companies ended within the quarter, not because of legal compulsion, but because the people who sat on those boards read the investigation report and made a calculation about the quality of judgment he had been exercising all along. He did not lose his standing as a result of Evan Rourke. He lost it as the accumulated consequence of a long series of decisions in which he had chosen speed over accuracy and personal profit over accountability, and the Rourke situation had simply made the pattern visible to people who had previously chosen not to look. Victoria Blackwell retained her position under a governance restructuring that installed an independent technical oversight committee with veto authority over safety certifications, severed the executive compensation structure from single event milestones, and required third-party verification of all land and intellectual property rights before any physical project work could begin. She rewrote the company's conflict of interest disclosure policy herself and presented the revised framework to the board alongside a public statement that specified, by name and by year, the originating work that had made the Tempest possible. She did not do any of this because she had been ordered to. She did it because the sequence of events that had begun with a demolished wall in Redhaven had shown her, more precisely than any board review could have, the exact distance between the company she had believed she was running and the one that had actually been operating under her signature. The new route between the assembly facility and the lakeside demonstration stage added nearly 1.5 miles to the convoy path, swinging north of the Rourke parcel before connecting with the approach road. It required the bridge that Sterling had spent 8 months trying to avoid, and the bridge was built correctly and on schedule because no one was hiding a parcel boundary dispute inside the budget estimate. Evan did not attend the rescheduled launch. He was at the garage when the convoy passed, 6 Tempests in electric blue against the gray Michigan morning, and he turned back to the restoration project on his lift before the last one disappeared around the curve. The royalty arrangement from the vector frame license was sufficient to cover the property taxes, the equipment replacement, and a modest expansion of the training program he had started for 3 apprentices the previous fall. Victoria stopped at the garage before she joined the convoy at the stage. She came in without an entourage, looked at the rebuilt east wall for a moment, and asked Evan whether he thought the road they had taken to get here had been worth the length of it. He said that a shortcut was only useful when it didn't go through something that belonged to someone else. She handed him the key to the first production Tempest off the line and said it was a gesture he was under no obligation to accept. He set the key on the workbench and offered to check the crossmember before she drove it to the stage. She said she trusted the certification. He said trust and verification were not the same thing, and she laughed in the way that people laugh when they recognize something they had to learn the hard way. He lifted the hood, checked the modified crossmember mounting, and closed it without saying anything was wrong, because nothing was. Victoria took the key back, paused at the garage door, and asked if he had anything to say about the car. Evan looked at the Tempest, at the lines that carried the mechanical logic his grandfather had worked out on a drafting table in this same building more than 50 years before, and said, now it knows where it came from. The car rolled out of Rourke Heritage Garage and followed the longer road toward the lake, and behind it the east wall stood whole, built from old brick and new mortar, the way most lasting things are built.